The morning I found it, I sat with it in my palm for a long time, without moving. The canoe was still overturned on the gravel bar where I'd left it the night before. The fire was cold ash. Huck was at my knee, not asking for anything, just leaning there the way old dogs do when they know something is wrong with you. I turned the stone over 3 times. The spiral was carved, not worn. It had been put there by something that understood what it was doing. I knew that the way you know a thing before you can say it out loud. I need to go back a few days to explain what that stone meant. Not just what it was, but what it cost to find it. Because without the 18 months before that morning on the Claremont, the stone is just a curiosity. With them, it is something else entirely. Carol died in March, a year and a half before that September. She'd been sick for 3 years, and I will not pretend the ending was a surprise, because it wasn't. You can know a thing is coming for a long time and still be completely unprepared for the morning it arrives. I was 61 years old and had spent most of those years on or near water, first as a working guide on rivers from the Claremont down to the lower Colden, and then, for the last decade, just managing the land and the small guiding work that came through word of mouth. There were 34 seasons of guiding behind me by then. I had run the Claremont for clients in every condition the river produced, from spring high water that came up over the gravel bars in a single afternoon, to the late summer low when you scraped paint off the keel on the rock spine below the second bend. I had pulled drowned men out of 2 different rivers in 2 different decades, both times in conditions that had been described as safe, and the lesson I had taken from those mornings was the lesson my own father had given me when I'd started. The river does not know who you are. It does not adjust. You adjust to it, or you do not. My father had been a logger who'd switched to guiding in the late 50s when the timber wages got shaky, and he'd run the lower Claremont for 30 years before he handed me his canoe and his maps and went into the back room of the cabin to die of emphysema in the spring of 1983. The last thing he'd said to me in any complete sentence was, "You read the bank and not the water. The water tells you what is. The bank tells you what is coming." I have repeated that to myself on the put-in of every river trip I have made for 40 years. I had repeated it that Tuesday morning standing at the county access lot, with the boat half loaded and the mist still on the river, and Huck waiting on the bow pad with his nose into the wind. I had been thinking about my father then, and I had not yet been thinking about Carol, which is a strange way to begin a trip on land that came to you through her family, and I noted it at the time without doing anything with the notice. There is a way that grief reorganizes itself in your attention without warning, and I had stopped fighting it about a year in. Some mornings I missed Carol most acutely. Other mornings the absence I felt was somebody who had been gone 40 years already. I had stopped trying to keep them in the right order. I let them come up however they wanted to come up. Carol had been the one who remembered to eat. She had been the one who left a smooth river stone at every campfire ring we'd made together, a habit she picked up from her grandmother and never let go of. One stone, placed neat at the ring's edge, before we broke camp. She said it was a way of thanking the land for the fire. I had smiled at that for years, not unkindly, just with the tolerant skepticism of a man who trusts what he can measure. She had a particular way of doing it that I can still see clearly. She would crouch at the edge of the dead ash, not on the windward side because she said the wind would scatter the smell, and she wanted the smell to settle, and she would set the stone with one hand, then put 2 fingers on it for a moment, then stand back up and brush her palms together once. She did not speak when she did it. She had told me, the 2nd or 3rd time I had watched her, that her grandmother had said you did not need to say anything because the land had been listening to you the whole time you had the fire and you were not telling it anything new. I had let that sentence sit in me without arguing it, the way I had let a number of Carol's grandmother's sentences sit in me over the years. She came from a line of women in the Cumberland country who had thought about land in a way I had not been raised to think about it. And the smartest thing I ever did in my marriage was learn to listen to that line of thinking without trying to bend it into the shape of my own. The morning I left for the Claremont that September, I had pulled a smooth grey stone from the bowl on the kitchen counter where she had kept her last few. I had put it in the side pocket of the dry bag that held the cook gear. I had not examined the impulse. I had simply kept it the way I had kept her habit, which is what you do when somebody you loved leaves you holding something that does not weigh much but cannot be set down. After she died, I kept doing it. I don't know when I started, I just know that by the time I got to the Claremont that September, I had been doing it for at least a year, setting one smooth stone at the edge of every cold ring I left behind, without examining why. Our daughter Della had not spoken to me in more than a year at that point. The estrangement did not begin with Carol's death. It had been building longer than that, and I will not lay all of it at Della's feet, because a fair portion of it belongs to mine. I am not a man who handles grief loudly. I went quiet in the months after the funeral, went into the daily mechanics of the property and the land and the equipment, and by the time I looked up, Della had stopped calling. I tried twice, left 2 messages, and the phone had stayed quiet. I had stopped trying after that, which was the wrong thing to do. And I knew it was the wrong thing even as I did it. There is a particular kind of cowardice that wears the face of patience. I had been wearing it for 13 months. The Claremont trip was practical, not sentimental. Carol's family had owned a 200-acre parcel along a 12-mile stretch of the river's middle reach, and it had come to me after the estate settled. I needed to walk the fence line along the lower portion, check the condition of the 2 primitive campsites I leased to a small outfitter out of town, and make sure the winter hadn't caved anything in at the equipment cache near the second bend. I had made this trip 9 years ago with Carol, the last time I'd run this particular stretch solo. Before that, I'd guided it dozens of times. I knew every gravel bar, every sweeper, every place the current pushed wide against the eastern bank and hid a shallow ledge underneath. It was familiar water, familiar in the way that old tools are familiar. The specific weight and balance of something you have carried so long, you stop noticing it, until one day you pick it up and notice it was never just a tool. Huck rode in the bow, as he always had. He was 11 years old that fall, getting grey around his muzzle, and he'd lost most of his interest in chasing anything. But he still wanted to be on the water. He planted himself on the bow thwart's foam pad and watched the banks the way he'd watched them since he was 2 years old, his nose working steadily, ears folded down in the wind. He never barked on the river. That had always struck people as odd for a beagle, but Huck had learned early that the water carried sound in unusual ways, and that barking spooked the fish Carol liked to watch from the canoe. He had adjusted himself to the river's etiquette without being asked. The first day was flat. I put in at the county access lot around 8 in the morning, a Tuesday in late September, when the sky was the specific grey of old tin, and the air smelled like wet leaves and cold iron. I ran the first 6 miles by early afternoon, checked the upper campsite, found the fire ring intact and the lean-to roof sound, replaced 2 rotten boards on the gear cache platform, and made camp on a wide gravel bar above the second bend. I set a stone at the ring's edge when I broke camp the next morning. One smooth river stone, placed neat, the way Carol had done it. I did it without thinking. Day 2 was where the river changed. I put in around 7:30, the mist still low enough to blur the tree line on both banks. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared to a pale, flat blue that held no warmth. I was working the current along the eastern bank where the channel narrowed between two long gravel shelves, and I noticed the birds had stopped. Not gradually, the way birds quiet when a storm is coming, but all at once, like a switch. I had run enough river in my life to know that birds don't do that for nothing. You can go half a day on quiet water with nothing but the paddle pull and the current's sound, and that is a certain kind of silence. This was a different kind. The first kind is empty. This kind was full. I noted the change the way I had been trained to note things, without immediate conclusion. There was no threat visible. Huck had lifted his nose from the bow pad and was pointing it towards the eastern bank, slow and deliberate, not alert the way he'd go alert at a coyote, just attentive. His tail was level, not raised. I have known that dog well enough to read him, and he was not afraid. He was curious. That distinction mattered more to me than I could have explained at the time. I worked through my first explanation without embarrassment. A black bear, most likely, moving parallel to the water in the alder, which the birds would register before I could see it. The eastern bank along that stretch was thick, second-growth alder and hemlock, with enough understory to hide a bear easily. I have seen bear on this river before, and the silence they bring is real and well known. I paddled on, watching the bank, and after about 10 minutes the bird song picked back up behind me on the western shore. The eastern bank stayed quiet for another quarter mile, then half a mile, then I stopped counting. That is more than a bear. A bear does not shadow you for a half mile of river. A bear moves through and the birds settle back. I paddled steadily and kept my eyes on the eastern bank and tried to see through the alder. I could not. The current pulled me south at about 3 miles an hour, and the silence on the eastern bank kept pace. I want to be honest about this because I spent a good portion of that morning trying very hard to find the simpler answer. The silence could be coincidental. The stretch of bank might simply hold less bird territory for reasons I did not understand. Habitat, seasonal shift, some natural factor I was assigning intention where there was none. I am a man who has spent 40 years outdoors, and I know the difference between a pattern and a coincidence. And I also know that knowing the difference does not mean you can always trust your reading of it. I paddled on. If you've been on moving water alone, you know how sound works. You know the river carries your noise downstream, and the wind carries the bank's noise to you, and you develop a feel for the direction of things that is partly mechanical and partly something harder to name. Around midday, I heard something in the alder that was not the wind. I am not going to dress it up into something dramatic. It was a movement, a careful movement, the specific sound of something large placing weight deliberately among wet leaves and old branches. Not crashing, not fleeing, pacing. I stopped paddling and let the canoe drift. Huck had turned his whole body around on the bow thwart to face the eastern bank, his nose high, his tail absolutely still. He made no sound. I held the paddle across my knees and listened. The movement stopped when I stopped. I paddled 2 strokes. The movement resumed, keeping pace, maybe 40 feet into the alder from the water's edge. I could not see it. Whatever it was, it knew how to stay inside the trees. I ran 3 more failed explanations before I made camp that afternoon. A deer which does not pace a canoe for 2 hours. A river otter which does not move in alder on the bank's high ground. A second bear, which I dismissed for the same reason I dismissed the first. By the time I pulled the canoe onto the gravel bar at the second campsite and overturned it for the night, I had stopped trying to explain and started just paying attention, the way my father had taught me to pay attention to a piece of equipment that was starting to behave unusually. You don't reach for a wrench immediately. You watch it first. The afternoon's evidence had been adding up in small doses. At one point, around 2 o'clock, I had pulled into an eddy on the eastern bank to check the fence line where it came down to the river, and I had walked up the bank about 30 feet into the alder. The undergrowth was thick and wet. About 15 feet in, I found 2 alder branches that had been bent back and held down, not broken, but woven together at a height that stopped me. I am 6 feet tall. I reached up as high as I could, and my fingertips put me at about 8 feet, maybe 8.5. The bent point of those branches was above that. I stood there and looked at it and thought about it. Deer rub. That was my first thought. No deer rubs alders at 8 feet. Elk, maybe, but there are no elk on this reach of the Claremont. I thought about the weight it would take to bend green alder down to that angle and hold it, and I could not build that into any animal I knew on this water. I measured the bent point against my own reach, twice. I noted that I could not reproduce the angle without a ladder. I noted that there were no marks I could identify on the ground beneath the branches, the undergrowth too thick and dry for impressions. I went back to the canoe and ate lunch and did not mention it to Huck, which is the kind of thing you do when you live alone. That is only the second time I have told anyone this story. I want you to understand that. I made camp that evening on a broad gravel bar with good sight lines in 3 directions and the hemlock stand close on the eastern bank. I ate a real dinner, 2 cans of something warm over the small camp stove, and I set the fire going and sat with Huck for a long while after dark, watching the river. The far bank was dark and still. A screech owl called once from the hemlock at around 9 o'clock, and then did not call again, which I noticed. I turned in around 10, put Huck in the tent beside me, and slept badly, not from fear, but from the particular alertness that comes over you when something large and unknown has been sharing your day. I woke at first light and stepped out of the tent to start the stove. The canoe was where I had left it, overturned on the upper end of the gravel bar, the way I always left it at night. I started walking toward it to flip it right side up and begin loading, the way I had started every river morning for 40 years. I stopped about 10 feet away. There was a stone resting on the hull near the stern. I could see it from where I stood, palm-sized, flat, river-smoothed, the colour of the gravel around it, but darker. I walked up and looked at it. I did not touch it immediately. I crouched down and looked at it from the side. A spiral had been carved into its face, not scratched, not worn, carved, with something narrow and deliberate that had taken time and intention. The lines were clean, the spiral turning inward from the stone's edge to a point near the centre, 3 full rotations. It was a small, beautiful thing. I picked it up. It fit exactly in my palm. I turned it over, and the back was plain, uncarved, the river's work only. I stood up and looked at the bank. The hemlock stand began about 40 feet from where I was standing, across the thin gravel strip that edged the water. I walked to the water's edge and looked at the soft clay along the margin. There was one impression there, about 14 inches from heel to toe, 5 inches wide across the ball, pressed deep enough that I could see the individual weight of the forward step in how the clay had compressed. Just the one. Whatever had stood there had stood still to leave the stone and then stepped back onto the hard gravel, and the gravel held nothing. I crouched beside the impression for a while. Huck sniffed at it thoroughly and then sat down beside me, which is the most he ever does when something doesn't trouble him. The clay was wet from the night's cold, which meant the impression was fresh, made in the dark or the very early morning. Something had come to the water's edge in the dark while I slept, and had placed that stone on the hull of my canoe, and then gone back into the trees without waking the dog. A beagle that doesn't bark when something walks past the tent in the night is telling you something. I know that. I sat on the gravel bar with the stone in my hand and the fire cold, and Huck leaning against my knee, and I did not move for a long time. I thought about Carol setting a smooth stone at the edge of every campfire ring we had ever shared. I had done it the morning before. I had placed a plain stone at the ring's edge on day 1, and again yesterday morning on day 2, before I put in the way she had always done it, and something had watched me do it and had answered. That thought arrived quietly and then sat there, and I could not make it smaller. I packed up camp slowly that morning, more slowly than usual. I ate, I broke down the stove, I loaded the dry bags, and I kept the carved stone in my jacket pocket where I could feel it through the canvas. I did not set a plain stone at the ring's edge that morning. I'm not sure why I didn't. It felt like something had already been said at this particular fire, and I did not want to answer carelessly. I pushed off around 8:30. The eastern bank was quiet again, the specific full quiet I had learned to recognize by now, and I paddled without urgency because I was not entirely sure I wanted the day to end. Around 4 in the afternoon, with about 2 miles left to the takeout, I came around the last long bend and the river widened into a still reach where the hemlock stood thick to the water on both sides and the late light fell through in long, orange columns. I had run this reach dozens of times. I knew the way the light gathered there in the late afternoon, the particular warmth of it before it went cold, and I slowed the canoe because the light deserved it and because I was not ready. Huck went still first. He turned his nose toward the eastern bank and held it there. And then I saw the figure. It was standing at the waterline on the eastern bank, 60 feet across the current. I do not know how long it had been there before I saw it. It was large, very large, dark-furred, upright in the way that nothing upright has any business being in that stand of hemlock. 8 feet at least, probably more. I cannot give you a precise number because my ability to measure left me for a few seconds. It stood still, not frozen the way a deer freezes, not coiled the way a threatened animal coils. Still in the way a person stands still when they have chosen to be seen. I stopped paddling. The current held the canoe nearly motionless in the wide reach, the paddle flat on the water's surface, and I looked across 60 feet of moving water at something I did not have a category for. I want to be careful here because I am not a person who reaches for easy conclusions. I am 61 years old, and I have spent most of those years outdoors, and I do not casually say I have seen something I cannot explain. I have said it once before in my life about a weather pattern on the lower river that I still cannot account for, and that one took me 3 years to mention to anyone. This one I have said twice. Once to my own kitchen wall about a week after I got home, and now to you. The figure turned its head and looked directly at the canoe, at me, and there was a quality of attention in that look that I am not going to try to put into better words than that. It was not hostile. It was not curious in the way an animal is curious, the sideways assessment of something trying to determine whether you are food or threat. It was direct and calm, the attention of something that had already made up its mind about you and was simply letting you know that it had. Huck made no sound. His tail moved once, the slow, easy wave that meant something was all right. I do not know how long I sat in that canoe. The current was moving me very slowly downstream, maybe a foot a second, and I kept thinking I should back paddle to hold position, and I could not bring myself to move. I held the paddle flat on the water and drifted, and the figure stood at the waterline and did not move. The light was changing. The orange columns in the hemlock were going amber, going gold, going the specific deep color that late September makes when the leaves have just started to turn, and the sun is an hour from gone. Something loosened in me. I am not going to name it differently than that, because I don't have a better word, and any other word I tried would be wrong. Something that had been locked since March of the year before, since the morning I stood in the kitchen at 5 a.m., knowing the night had taken Carol and not yet able to dial the phone. That specific sealed thing loosened. Not broke, not released, not healed. Those are all too large and too certain. Loosened, the way a door loosens in its frame when the wood finally settles in dry weather, so that the latch catches again when it had not been catching. Something that had been slightly wrong went slightly less wrong, there in 60 feet of moving water, with an amber light in the hemlocks and an old beagle making no sound at the bow. I reached into my jacket pocket and I felt the carved stone. I didn't take it out. I just held it through the canvas, the way you hold something when you are not sure whether to offer it or keep it, and you are not ready to decide. After a while, the figure turned without urgency and walked back into the hemlock stand. 3 steps, and it was inside the trees. 2 more, and it was gone. I could hear nothing of its passage. The hemlock gave no particular sound. It had simply walked into the trees the way the trees had always belonged to it, and the trees had accepted it back without any fuss. I sat in the drifting canoe for another few minutes after that. The light finished its change. Huck turned around on the bow thwart and looked at me, his brown eyes steady, and then he put his nose back down on the pad and sighed, which is what he does when he thinks the interesting part is over. I paddled out the last 2 miles in near dark. The takeout lot had 2 trucks in it when I came around the final bend. One from the outfitter I leased the campsites to, which meant somebody had come down to check on me, and one I didn't recognize. I pulled the canoe up the concrete ramp and the outfitter's man, a young guy named Pete, who I'd known since he was learning to back a trailer, came down to help me carry the hull. He didn't ask how the trip was, which Pete never did, because he had worked for me long enough to know I would tell him what I wanted to tell him, and that questions were generally not the way to get it. "Fence line's good," I said. "Cash roof held. Lower lean-to needs a rafter." "I'll get to it before October," Pete said. That was all we said about the trip. There was a payphone at the far end of the parking lot, bolted to a wooden post between the bulletin board and the trash can, the kind of outdoor phone that rural river access lots kept posted for the specific reason that your cell signal was gone for 30 miles in either direction. I had used it once before, 2 summers ago, to call for a weather report when the sky to the south went the wrong color at noon. I had noticed it every time I put in or took out, without ever thinking much about it. I noticed it now. I loaded Huck into the truck cab. I loaded the dry bags and the paddles and tied the canoe down. I went around and checked the knots the way I always checked them. 2 points each, the habit so old it required no thought. Then I walked to the payphone and picked it up, and dropped in the coins I found in my jacket pocket. 2 quarters and a dime. Not enough. And I went back to the truck and searched the console until I found $1 worth of change, which took me about 3 minutes, and probably looked strange to anyone watching. A man rummaging his truck console in a dark parking lot at the end of a river trip. I dialed Della's number. I had not dialed it in 13 months. I knew it without looking it up because you know your daughter's number the same way you know what your own hands look like. The phone rang 4 times, and I had already started composing what I would say to the machine, the way you prepare a message for a call you are not sure will be answered. It rang a 5th time. She picked up. "Dad." That was all she said at first. "Della." I held the receiver and watched the dark tree line at the far side of the lot. I know it's been a while. There was a pause, the particular pause that carries more than a word would. "It has," she said. "I wanted to." I stopped, tried again. "I should have called before now." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, which meant she was trying to find the words the same way I was. We are alike in that, which has always made things harder between us and also, occasionally, easier. "Are you okay?" she said. "I think I'm getting there," I said. "I had a strange few days. I don't know how to explain it yet." "You don't have to," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that loosened the same door again, just slightly, the latch catching again. We talked for 9 minutes, which I know because the payphone was counting down my change on a display that I watched without reading. We did not resolve anything large. We talked the way people talk when they are trying to remember how to talk, the careful, practical sentences that mean something other than what they say. She had a new job. She was thinking about coming back for the winter holidays. I said I hoped she would. She said she thought she might. When I hung up, I stood at the payphone for a moment with my hand still on the receiver, the metal cold under my palm, the parking lot quiet around me. Then I walked back to the truck and got in, and Huck climbed over the console and put his head in my lap, the way he did whenever I had been still for too long. I sat there a minute with my hand on his ear. The carved stone was still in my jacket pocket. I took it out and set it on the dash above the steering wheel, where I could see it in the dark, the spiral facing up. I drove home. I have thought about that trip many times in the 4 months since. I have picked up the stone and put it down. I have turned it over in my hand in the evenings when the kitchen feels too quiet and the habit of grief starts to pull. And I've thought about the specific logic of what happened out there. The carved spiral left on the hull of my canoe in the dark. The full quiet on the eastern bank across 2 days. The bent alders at a height nothing I know reaches. The figure at the waterline in the amber light. The wordless and unhurried way it turned and walked back into the trees. I have not arrived at an explanation. I want to be honest about that. I have not decided what I believe. The rational disbelief I carry by trade has not been fully satisfied, and I do not think it ever will be. What I know is that I set a plain stone at a cold fire ring on the morning of day 2, the way Carol had always done it, the way I had been doing it for a year without examining the habit, and that by the morning of day 3, something had answered with a carved one. I know that whatever had been pacing me on the eastern bank for the better part of 2 days was not afraid of me, and that its presence on that particular river in that particular week had something to do with the specific shape of the time I had been carrying. Whether that is coincidence or something else is a question I have set down beside the stone on my windowsill and left there. Della came for Christmas. She stayed 4 days, which is more than she had stayed since Carol was alive. We cooked together and we talked about Carol without it being a transaction in pain, the way it had been at the funeral, the way grief gets when it goes too long without company. On the second evening, she picked up the stone from the windowsill and turned it over in her hand and asked where I'd gotten it. "On the Claremont," I said. "Last fall." "Did you carve it?" she asked. "No," I said. She turned it over again, the spiral facing up, and set it back on the sill. She didn't ask anything else, and I didn't offer anything else, and that felt like the right amount. Pete has taken over the outfitter lease on the Claremont land formally now, which means I have less reason to run the river for practical purposes and more reason to run it for the other kind. I plan to go back in the spring, when the water is high and cold and the alders are just coming in, when the eastern bank is all new green and the current runs fast through the narrow channel between the gravel shelves. I plan to take Huck, who is moving slower these days but still wants the bow thwart and the water smell. I plan to set a stone at the fire ring on the first morning, one plain river-smooth stone placed neat at the ring's edge, the way Carol did it, the way I have been doing it since she left, the way I intend to keep doing it as long as I can reach down to the water and find one. Whether anything answers is not something I need to know in advance. Huck is lying at my feet right now, his head on his paws, his breathing slow and even in the way of an old dog who has worked out that the floor is the best place in the room. The carved stone is on the windowsill. Outside the window, the trees begin 40 feet from the house, a stand of second-growth maple and hemlock that I have always thought of as simply the edge of my yard. These days, I sometimes stand at the window in the early morning before I start the stove, and I look at where the yard ends and the trees begin, at that specific line where the open ground gives way to the dark. I don't see anything. I don't expect to. I just look for a moment, the way you look at something you have stopped taking for granted. Then I start the stove, and the water comes to boil, and the day begins. If something out there has ever paced you along the water's edge and you weren't sure what to make of it, the next story is already on screen.